also want to chime in here, saying warmly welcome to this seminar. And my name is Helena Saari. I'm co-founder of the GU-CAS network. And I'm delighted to introduce our invited guest speaker, Helena Saari. So Maria Saari is a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Oulu and a visiting scholar at the Human Animal Studies Hub at the Institute of Social Sciences at the University of Lisbon in Portugal. Maria Saari's doctoral thesis, entitled Animals as Stakeholders in Education Towards an Educational Reform for Interspecies Sustainability, won the Senior Animal Law Researcher Award from the International Center for Animal Law and Policy last year. Maria Saari is also co-leader of the Envisioning Sustainability Hub of the Biodiverse Anthropocene research program and the Environmental Education Working Group of the Global Innovation Network in Teaching and Learning Partnership between the University of Oulu and the University of Namibia. I hope I got that right, Maria. She is also the chair of the Finnish Critical Animal Studies Network. Maria Saari's work focuses on multispecies environmental education and sustainability, animal-inclusive pedagogies and policies, multispecies childhood studies, interspecies justice, and animal law. She is published in journals such as Cultural Studies of Science Education, International Journal of Educational Excellence, and Educational Studies, and she is a frequently invited speaker at both academic and activist events. And the title of Maria's lecture today is Animals as Stakeholders in Education, Pathways Towards Interspecies Sustainability. We are so excited to have you here, Maria, and I'm delighted to give the floor to you. So please welcome Dr. Helena Saari.
Thank you everyone for being here today, and a special thank you to Helena and to Jonna for inviting me, and to the whole GU-CAS network for all that you do and for the opportunity to be here today. I was going to start by introducing myself, but I won't do that now, but I would just like to mention that 2021, when I defended my doctoral thesis, Helena Pedersen was my opponent in my defense event. So it's quite an honor, and I'm very grateful for the opportunity to present my work here today. So really, if I retire now from research, this will be the highlight of my career. But just kidding, there is a lot still to be done for animals and to change education for the better. One of my research fellows I would just like to highlight here. So I do work in different research teams and different research projects, and I'll briefly talk about them in a minute, but I would just like to highlight that a lot of my research is done for animals, and especially cows. And this is Joao. He's 4 years old, and he's living a happy life on a sanctuary in Portugal after being rescued from the dairy industry. So I'm working at the University of Oulu mainly, and my research group is called Animate. If you want to learn more about our work, so we work in education and across childhood studies and sustainability, and we run different projects in schools in Finland, but I'll give you the link to our website at the end of the talk. So currently I'm working in 3 projects. The first one, Flourished, is one that I'm running now in Portugal, and trying to really find out ways of how to bring animals into the discussion of the climate crisis in schools, which is very much constrained by specific curriculum requirements. And so we're just trying to trial out methods of how do we bring animals in to the debate and discussion of sustainability, and there I'm working with high school students. The second one, City Rats, is based at the University of Oulu, where we ran a citizen science workshop with secondary school students, and I was involved mainly in the last part of that project, running speculative fiction workshops with these students, trying to imagine what could alternative, more flourishing, just futures look like between humans and animals. And then the last one is really about trying to find ways of developing pre-service teacher education in Finland and in Namibia, and we're trying to find ways and really have a critical, constructive discussion of the role of sustainable development guidelines in these different contexts, and how do we bring, well, my perspective, what I'm bringing to that work is how to bring animals into these discussions. But before I jump into talking a bit about my doctoral research, and then I'll give you some examples specifically about the actual education work that I'm doing, trying to implement what I'll first be talking about in theory. But I'll first explain, how did I get into this? How did I start working in this field of animals and education? So before research, about 10 years ago, I was working in the field of education, in early childhood education more specifically. And it was there that I began to notice or become uncomfortable with the ways that we talk and teach about animals in these different educational settings. So I was working as a primary school teacher in Spain, and we took our students to a dairy farm. And really seeing the cows and seeing how the animals are treated there, it really hit me that this is something I would like to continue working on, really trying to find ways as how could I, as a teacher, in these limiting spaces, what can I do differently? Because at the moment, working in those contexts, I felt like my hands were really tied, that there was not much I could do differently. So I followed the curriculum and I taught what they required me to teach. So that's really what got me into the field of research. And before I did my PhD, I studied in Barcelona, I studied animal law. And again, not knowing what is happening in this field. Is there such a research field as animals and education? And that's when I found Helena's book, Animals in Schools, and I found my community. I found a path forward that I'm not the only one thinking about these issues. So really that book and these events took me on this research journey. Now I'll talk a bit about what I found out, or where did my PhD take me. So really, as probably all of you in this room know, and I'm going to apologize now for my very text-heavy slides, but I think it can be a useful teaching or learning tool. So if you want to take pictures, or if you want copies of these slides later, then feel free and I'll share them with you. So really trying to understand the dairy industry and education, and when I began to read more about the sustainability literature, I found out that there really is this growing critique of what is called the politics of unsustainability. So we are aware of what is happening, we are aware we're living in a crisis, but very little continues to be done. And a lot has to do also with the guiding principles that are used to guide educational practices. For example, sustainable development, which is strongly inherent as a guiding principle in the Finnish national curriculum. And there have been growing calls to build what Stratford and Wells called healthy policy ecologies. How do we create healthy and creative policy and alternatives if what we find that the current policies guiding educational practices are insufficient? So these are some of the ideas that really sparked me to try to experiment with different conceptual tools that I'll talk about a bit later, to really find answers to, like Helena has rightly said, that education and its connections to the animal industrial complex, they do create profoundly unsafe realities for animals. And if the policies that guide educational practice are complicit in that, how do we start dismantling those guiding principles? And how do we start creating educational spaces that are safe for children and also for animals? There are also growing calls for children and also for animals to be understood as stakeholders in their own right, stakeholders in their own lives, and stakeholders in sustainability. But despite there being an increased focus on that education needs to develop different pedagogies and tools, and that we need to find ways to live responsibly on this damaged earth, like the Commonwealth Collective have rightly said, there still is a curious silence about animals. So how do we bring animals into these discussions? To try to find answers to some of these questions, I set out on a 4-year PhD journey, and my guiding question, my main question was, how could we move towards an education reform for interspecies sustainability where animals too are understood as educational stakeholders? So I looked at different dimensions of what this could look like. I looked at policy, different pedagogical tools, so what are the tools already offered by the growing research field of animal inclusive education? So what openings do these pedagogies offer us to bring animals into educational spaces? And then I wanted to find out what might this look like in practice. So I interviewed some humane education organizations on their experiences carrying out this work and what can we learn from their lessons, from their struggles, their opportunities, and could we together build a growing network and make education more widely one that supports animal flourishing too. So in my research I used cows and school milk schemes as a case example of the connections between education or schools and the animal industrial complex, and also as an example of how education could be understood as consisting of a common violent world between children and animals. I used a multidimensional approach to really look at the school as a whole and the opportunities that it gives us, and to seek pathways for including animals in the sustainability debate and education policy and practice. Now, trying to understand really the gravity of the violence against animals and trying to find the conceptual tools or how to put into words what is happening to animals on a societal scale. And in my research, I came across Dinesh Wadiwel's work and his book War Against Animals. And that's when I found, or I felt I had found, some very useful tools to really talk about, to find ways to put into words the scale and gravity of what is happening to animals. So Wadiwel argues that the hostility and the systemic violence in our society against animals could be understood as us being at war against animals. Now, it doesn't matter if we agree with this language or with this framing or not. However, what he proposes and his arguments about how this war shapes our society and the systemic hostility, it can give us useful tools to discuss these matters further. And Manisha Decker has rightly summarized this argument, and she says that to say that humans and corporations are at war with animals, as Dinesh Wadiwel does, is not to engage in hyperbole, because by almost any metric or angle we adopt, whether it's annual numbers of land and sea animals killed, in farming, the rate of species extinction or genocide, the profits and processes of the trade in exotic animals, or simply hearing stories about individual animals and the violence that they experience, really the escalating levels of violence to which animals are subject is undeniably obscene. So, if we understand that systemic violence and hostility is the mainstay of our societal relations with animals, as Wadiwel argues, then what might that tell us about education and its space in that society? So I tried to think about this through Dinesh Wadiwel's proposal of violence and war, and he argues that there are three dimensions of violence through which dominant human-animal relations are constituted and operated. And these are intersubjective, institutional, and epistemic. And these different violences, he argues, they interact and move in a circular relation with each other. So intersubjective violence, he argues, is interpersonal violence against individual animals. Institutional violence or structural violence is really how our institutions are established and operated. And epistemic violence really underpins all of that. Epistemic violence means that the animal is constructed socially in such a way that they are less than us, that they are beneath us, and that justifies our violence against them. And if education can be seen connected to what Wadiwel calls hotspots of violence, and sometimes educational spaces can serve as sites of violence too, where various often conflicting human-animal relations are reproduced. So if education can be connected to hotspots of violence, how could we, what needs to be done so that schools could serve as spaces of peace, or at least spaces where peaceable relations are strived for? I'm just going to give you one example of one of the education policies that I looked at in my thesis. But I really wanted to start mapping a policy ecosystem of the educational landscape in my thesis. And now I've moved beyond that, so to look at not just education policies, but how do they intersect and how do they connect with policies beyond the education landscape. But in my thesis, I found useful conceptual tools, thinking tools, from the growing field of political ecology of education that really looks at how pedagogies and educational practices are shaped by different policy landscapes. And to come back to the dairy industry, so one of the policies that I looked at was the European Union's School Fruit, Vegetables and Milk Scheme, which targets the declining consumption of fresh fruit, vegetables and cow's milk, and is said to promote healthy eating habits. In the 2019-2020 school year, 105 million euros were allocated to cow's milk subsidies in the EU, which was a 5 million increase from the year before. And in the 2018-19 school year, approximately 155,000 schools took part in the scheme, and that means over 20 million children were part of this scheme. Now the policy narrative, or the narrative underpinning and justifying this policy, is really children's health, that we are protecting children's health by promoting the consumption of cow's milk, because, as they argue, it's natural and necessary. There are hardly any references to cows in these policy documents, but cows are highly visible in the educational materials that are required for schools to implement when they take up this scheme. Griffin, who worked as the World Food Organization's advisor, he argued that children represent an important market because dietary habits are established in childhood and persist into adult life. And that's why programs such as school milk schemes, which encourage children to choose milk and milk products, are, as he argues, an investment in the future demand for milk. So really we can see schools as economic playgrounds where both children and cows are instrumentalized under these schemes. Looking a bit broader at the educational policy landscape, what I found, unsurprisingly, was that there is a hierarchically anthropocentric positioning of animals in these different policy documents. So the national curriculum of Finland, in the Sustainable Development Guidelines that really shape the Finnish national curriculum, and also in school milk schemes. They were also all framed through child-centered narratives. So sustainable development, it ultimately is justified as serving children and so-called future generations. The curriculum is framed as offering children and young people the tools and skills to become healthy, active, environmentally friendly citizens. And school milk schemes are framed through narratives of concern over children's health. There are strategic generalizations of animals. They're labeled as resources, species representatives, and a lot of it happens under the welfare narrative, which justifies our use of animals. There's also a lot of ambiguity with this welfare framing, and it sends the message, it justifies this message that animal interests are already addressed, that they are already protected and attended to. And within all of this, there are different interpretations of sustainability. And I would argue that the curriculum could be seen as serving as a specific tool of epistemic violence against other animals. Now, given all of this, how do we then move forward? How do we move towards long-term societal changes to more peaceable or flourishing human-animal relations? And how do we make the changes in attitudes and beliefs that could then push the change needed, or the pressure needed to change laws and policies for the better? There's no one answer, there's no simple answer, but really trying to understand social change more broadly and adopting what could be seen as a multifocal approach or a multifocal way of viewing what kind of tactics and strategies are needed to implement or push for these changes. However, how do we navigate these different strategies to achieve long-term goals while adopting appropriate tactics for short-term aims? And how, and can we even agree on, what are the short-term aims and long-term goals that we're aiming for? Can we find consensus even in the animal protection movement of what it is that we're aiming for? And that's one of the major struggles currently, is how do we collectively strategize and build these alliances to create bigger changes? And I think maybe that's something that we could discuss together. So in my thesis, I was really looking at alternative conceptual tools, alternative theories that could guide the process of how do we propose or build healthy policy ecologies or policy alternatives. If sustainability in its current form or sustainable development, if they're seen as insufficient, we need to have something to propose as an alternative, as at least an option to explore different solutions. So Iris Bergman has argued that sustainability and animal protection, it can be seen as an oxymoron, because farmed animals especially, they're treated as vehicles to achieve sustainability rather than being agents who, under a justice perspective, should be beneficiaries of the sustainability transition. Other scholars have argued that true sustainability can only be achieved if the interdependent needs of all species, current and future generations, are met. So interspecies sustainability really highlights and foregrounds the interdependence of all life. And it adopts a non-anthropocentric view of who or what is affected by policies. Now, interspecies sustainability could be seen as one pathway to include animals as stakeholders in policy narratives and in sustainability. But again, these theories, while promising, they might remain quite abstract. So really finding case studies or case examples of different place-based solutions, what would this look like in a specific context? And I think even though these theories are proposed, we need to, one way to move forward is really to trial them out in very specific locations to see what do we find out, how do we balance the conflicting interests that will arise when we try to meet the needs of all species, current generations and also future. And I think this is also something that I would like to invite for discussion after this lecture about really the promise and usefulness of these alternative conceptual tools and where can we take them? How do we take them further? Now I'd like to move on to giving some examples of what could animal inclusive education look like in practice. So what have I tried to do with my various research groups to implement or create educational spaces that are more inclusive of animals. And I'm going to give a few examples from Finland and Portugal, and actually also one from Namibia. So first, I'll talk a bit about the work that we're doing at the University of Oulu. And there we've, since 2018-2019, we've really tried to develop and implement courses that would bring animals into the sustainability debate. One of the courses that we've just finished for its 4th year is Introduction to Environmental Education, which is, it takes a broad view to the field of environmental education. I'll talk about that in a bit more detail soon. And one that is specifically focused on animals and education is Multispecies Childhood Studies, Challenging Anthropocentrism in Education. And these are offered as optional courses in our pre-service teacher education. We also run a master's thesis seminar on multi-species research and sustainability education. In addition to the taught courses, we do try and run different events and workshops really to invite critical debate around sustainability, animals and education. And these are some of the events. So the Envisioning Sustainability Research Hub that I co-lead, we've been running a lecture series online to invite scholars from around the world to discuss and debate sustainability. We organize different conference special interest groups and also different events within our, or hosted by our Animate research group. There's a conference coming up in October, which will be online at the University of Oulu. So I do invite you to send in your abstract if you'd like to present there. The conference is called Uncommon Worlds, Navigating and Inhabiting Biodiverse Anthropocenes. So moving on, I'd just like to discuss those 2 courses that I mentioned in a bit more detail and give these 2 examples of how animals are included in a very broad sense and in a very specific sense in these courses. So Introduction to Environmental Education is a course that we developed with Anna Vladimirova because there was no such course at our university. And the national curriculum of Finland requires teachers to teach about sustainability in their future work, but there was no such tools given or offered to them during their studies. So in this course, we cover the history and the development of the field of environmental education and some of the new directions in which it's headed, including animal inclusive education. We talk about policies and who can or should be understood as a stakeholder in different understandings or theories of sustainability. And we also like to offer our students what we call a toolbox or a toolbox pedagogies approach, where we offer them an overview of different pedagogies, whether that's humane education, critical animal studies, outdoor education, education for sustainability. So really we try to cover the bird's eye view of that whole field so they can each start building a toolbox of what works for them in their specific context. We do have a very international course each year, which is probably the highlight of that course, where we discuss the global issues and policies, but get really situated perspectives from the experiences of our students. And we have found that despite a broad network of students, they do have similar concerns. So how do we move beyond this idea of that recycling and just ticking the box, recycling, I've done my environmental education. How do we move beyond that, and how do we move beyond sustainable development guidelines? The benefits of having this international community is learning about the different policies and practices from different countries, and really to come together and critically and constructively debate ways of moving forward. These are just some examples of the final projects that our students have done, and as you can see, it's very varied. Each year we do have students doing their projects on plant-based food systems, looking at the environmental impact of current food systems and how to move towards plant-based food systems, a lot to do with permaculture and gardening, and looking at also eco-justice, education-inspired projects on how to live more harmoniously with other animals. Now the other course that we've implemented for the 4th year running is multispecies childhood studies. And this is very much bringing animals to the forefront. And what we cover in this course is the so-called animal turn in education, research and childhood studies. And the aim is to explore diverse child-animal relations, for example, looking at animals in school, at home, on the plate, and also in nature. We try to identify the role of animals in childhood and in society at large, and critically explore anthropocentric discourses, concepts and practices in different phases of childhood. And again, in this one, our students, they design a lesson plan of something that they would like to implement in their future teaching work, or they can carry out a research project. And these are some of the final projects that they have done. So really, again, there's a lot of ground covered here. We have case studies on cultural representations of animals or representations of animals in children's media. One group one year did a case study, or actually they came up with a lot of teaching strategies of how to teach about animal rights in early childhood education. Again, case studies on animals in food systems, where the group also created a song about animals in the food industry to use as a teaching resource in their future work. And then to give you another example of the work that's being done in Finland is the citizen science project that I mentioned earlier, and specifically the speculative fiction workshops that we ran with secondary school students. And in this we worked with a science fiction author and with the students in groups. They were given the question, what if? With this guiding question, what if, they began to what we call a multi-species world building exercise. So really try to imagine alternative futures of living with other animals. And we're just finishing a paper on some of the findings of this fieldwork, and really the limitations that we saw of working within formal education, specifically about time, the difficulty that we found of students really using imagination when right answers are not given to them. So these are just some of the things that we'll be discussing in the forthcoming publication. Another project that I was involved in, where I was part of a team developing some teaching resources that are free access online, and this was in the CLAN research project at the Human Animal Studies Hub at the University of Lisbon. And this was part of a project that looked at the interactions of children and animals in Portuguese homes. And what came out of this project was this CLAN outreach ecosystem, which included an exhibition and catalogue of photographs that the students took of the daily life that they had with their companion animals. Workshops with stakeholders, including we ran a webinar with the Portuguese Directorate of Education to launch this toolkit that we created to give them some learning resources. There's a film by Just Wondering on YouTube, which is great. If you want to check it out, I can give you the link. And there's also a collection of short stories by Becky Tipper, and we also published a children's book called Meow, which is by Joana Estrela. So the multi-species relations toolkit, it explores the emotional lives of animals, their communication and body language, possible habits, routine. What does the daily life of our companion animals look like? What kind of environments would make them happy and healthy? and what does it mean to live well in a multi-species home and multi-species community. It explores interspecies friendships and curious encounters with other animals in our immediate communities. And we also talk about animal shelters and feral lives. There's 9 or 10 activities, which include role play, storytelling. And really the aim of these activities is to encourage us to try to begin to imagine the experiences of other animals, how might they experience the world, and really to become attentive of the diverse ways animals communicate and who are these beings that we share our homes and communities with. And again, we wanted to highlight that there's no right or wrong answer to these questions, but really the aim is to encourage discussion and critical thinking and to practice art of attentiveness. Because also what we have found is that teachers are often reluctant to keep these conversations going. So children often will have questions, will want to debate. They will naturally ask difficult questions. And I find it really important to support teachers in holding space for that difficult conversation that we don't need to have a right answer to. And then lastly, from Portugal, this is a workshop, Climate Change and Disasters, Multi-Species Perspectives, that I ran in May. It just finished last week. So it was a 5-week workshop exploring climate change and disasters, looking at how might animals be affected in these events. I was working with almost 30 students in a high school in Lisbon, and this was a bilingual workshop where they could produce a research output either in Portuguese or in English. And really the idea behind this was that animals are among the most vulnerable populations affected by climate change and disasters, but they're often overlooked in media coverage, public debate, policies, and emergency responses. So students carried out research projects to explore the causes and effects of disasters and what might be possible pathways forward and solutions to creating opportunities for just and sustainable coexistence between humans and animals in the aftermath of disasters, and really predicting or mitigating future disasters. Some of the topics that they carried out their projects on were noise pollution, ocean pollution, a lot of projects on wildfires, looking at wildfires and the effects on bee populations, and also river rerouting. And there was one looking at the effects of the war in Ukraine on animals. Now lastly, I just want to go back to pre-service teacher education. And this is the 3rd project that I'm involved in, working across Finland and Namibia. And really the idea again is how do we bring up and find tools to discuss conflicting human-animal relations in educational settings, especially when there are diverse sustainability challenges and where guiding principles might be adopted differently in different contexts. And this has really been a very eye-opening experience of what strategies work in what context and how to adapt them depending on not just the location you work, but really being mindful of really the importance of place-responsive solutions and pedagogies. And this is again something that I'm happy to discuss in more details in the next part of this seminar. So overall, after working in these different projects, trying to implement these different courses in higher education, what have we learned in our research groups? We've learned, for example, that there can be quite serious limitations of working within formal schooling, like I mentioned earlier. So questions about time, assessment, is our work just another school task? Because even though it's something additional for the students, how do we align workshops with the curriculum where teachers need to reach certain targets, need to have something to assess at the end? might be requiring an enthusiastic teacher who is willing to test out these different methods with you. And again, some of these interventions really are one-off workshops, one-off events. So how do we do this in a way that would give us a bit more longevity in our efforts? Students have quite a few times come up to us and said, or when we've had these discussions with them, we can't all be expected to be Greta Thunberg. So really, how do we make learning meaningful to the everyday life of young people? And also, how do we do that in a way that not only empowers them, but also that doesn't put pressure on them to all be Greta Thunbergs? How do we go beyond the classroom and really take the learning outside to the real world? And throughout these different workshops and interventions, we have encountered difficulties of breaking through anthropocentric ways of thinking. The courses that we offer in Oulu, even though it's a promising development, they still are only optional courses. So we do have limited participation. However, there are also a lot of opportunities. Enthusiastic students, teachers, there's room for constructive debate. Leading by example, so carrying out these different projects shows teacher colleagues that it's possible to do this in their schools, and really building that network of partnerships. And I would argue that in the future, there is more focus needed on pre-service teacher training. So just to conclude, and maybe pose a few questions that we could discuss together afterwards. In my 6 years of research and teaching in environmental education, what I have found is that in Finland, there really is a particular opening for paving way for multi-species perspectives, because there is a consensus amongst pre-service teachers and also teachers that the tools that they're given, it's not enough. And there is consensus that sustainable development may not be the most helpful conceptual tool in guiding us forward in education. However, in these 6 years, really relatively small transformation has happened. But luckily there are diverse modes of animal inclusive education, and it's more about how do we carve out those pathways to implement them more systematically. However, in doing so, how do we stay accountable to animals and how to avoid epistemic violence against animals? And this is something that I reflect on quite a bit in trialing and testing these different methods and these different workshops. It's something that I think about quite often is, am I doing justice to animals in the way that I have framed this workshop, for example? And in doing so, in thinking about the longevity of these interventions, how do we think about temporality also in a different way? How do we make sure that the small things that we're doing now will carry forward? And that, I think, comes down to building effective alliances within the animal movement and also beyond, and really thinking about how do we collectively strategize, what are some of the tools that we can use, and what really are our long-term goals. If we don't know where we're actually heading as a collective, then our strategies and our tools may seem a bit scattered. And again, and lastly, how do we measure success? How do we think, was a course a success? Was a workshop a success? That's something I don't know, and that's something I'm throwing out there for us to discuss. And also to discuss how do we carve out and create these educational spaces of truth or peace. And just as a final thought, a quote that has been very important and influential for me is really, again quoting Helena and her colleague, who have said that by creating 1,000 tiny spaces for animal perspectives in school, education will, in the long term, not only contribute to the liberation of animals from harmful human interference in their lives, but also liberate itself from destructive practices and regimes based on speciesism as a category of difference and a mode of production. And as a last question for us all to discuss is, how do we create these 1,000 tiny spaces for animal perspectives in schools, and how do we bring them together to really create this wave of change? Thank you, and here are our websites if you want to take a look at our work.
Thank you so much, Maria. Thank you for that immensely enlightening